Go ahead and open to Hebrews chapter 11. And if you'll go to the end of the chapter, verse 37 is where we're going to be picking up. Today is the final lesson in our series on Hebrews chapter 11. And hopefully we've been encouraged by looking at these great people of faith and have seen those who have served God in times past and hopefully been challenged to serve Him faithfully today. And just something to consider before we get into the text today. We look at many of the people that are in this text and we think giants of the faith. We're talking about Abraham and David and Daniel and people like that. We think of them as giants of the faith. Consider this: they did not think of themselves that way. That wasn't their perception of themselves, that they were a giant of the faith, that they were simply servants of God and did what they could do in order to serve God. They faced doubts and fears like we do. They faced temptation and failure, and they struggled. And in the end, they persevered and they gained victory. And so as much as when we're reading about them, our mindset is to put them on pedestals. That's not the purpose of Hebrews chapter 11. It's not to put these people on pedestals. It is to focus on these people who had faith, and then the idea is we need to have the same, that we need to be imitators of these, and he gets to that when we go on into chapter 12. But let me say of Noah and Abraham and Daniel and David and so forth, they all put their tunics on one sleeve at a time, just like we do. Well, we don't have tunics necessarily, but that's a common phrase we use of somebody that we're not wanting to exalt somebody that they put their pants on one leg at a time, right? That they didn't wear pants, they wore tunics. But they are like you and I are like them. One of my favorite texts out of the book of James, James chapter 5, when it's talking about prayer, it says in verse 17, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. Elijah might be one of those that we talked about Elijah in the text. And we might put him on a pedestal, and James, writing by the Spirit of God, says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. You and I are like Elijah. You and I are like Abraham. You and I are like David. And so when we read about these giants of the faith, understand that they are given as examples so that you and I can be like them, that you and I can display the same kind of faith. All right, let's go. Hebrews chapter 11 and at verse 37. We already dealt with the first half of the verse. We'll pick up midway in the verse. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So in verse 37, the mid part of the verse, he makes this statement: they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. Again, no one specific is being referenced in this text. I do think a lot of the things that he's saying in the latter portion here are specific about prophets. The last thing that he had said before going into talking about all these things was the prophets, and then he dealt with a whole bunch of different scenarios that come up. Doesn't mean exclusive to the prophets, but there are some prophets that would fit what he's saying here. For instance, in the Septuagint of 2 Kings chapter 2, it is specifically identified that Elijah's mantle, which he left to his predecessor, or to his successor, Elisha, was made of sheepskin. And so he wore this mantle that was made of sheepskin. Many years later, John the Baptist comes along, and he would be clothed in camel's hair. Not quite sheepskin, not quite goatskin, but the same class of garment, if you will. Zechariah 13 and at verse 4, it seems to indicate that a coat of coarse hair was a common thing among the prophets. And we see that with Elijah and Elisha and with John the Baptist. And I don't know that there's others that specifically that's mentioned of, but Zechariah 13 does indicate that it was a common thing among the prophets. And so understand, we're not talking about high-end fashion here. They wore what was available to them. And typically that was the skin of animals that had been killed for sacrifice or whatever other cause. Some of God's people that were spoken of here in Hebrews 11, they had wealth. People like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David. Others did not. And I think it's important for us to understand that faithfulness to God is not linked in any way to material wealth. Despite the message of today's health and wealth preachers, and they'll spew out about how God's going to bless you with all kinds of things, that's not a message that's found in the Bible. Being called to the Lord does not have a thing to do with a promise of riches. Many of the prophets were without. The focus is on God and serving Him and the attainment of heaven, not the attainment of things that are going to pass away. And in fact, as the Hebrew writer says it, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. The very next thing he says is being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. The Apostle Paul, I understand Hebrews 11 doesn't include the Apostle Paul because he's not one of those of the Old Covenant. It's dealing with Old Testament examples. But the Apostle Paul would be a New Testament example of the very same kind of thing, this idea of being destitute and afflicted and tormented. Paul knew what that was. He was very well acquainted with being destitute. Philippians 4 at verse 12, he said this, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound everywhere, and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. He knew good times and he knew bad times, but he knew that God was going to provide for him in whatever the circumstance was. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 11, again Paul says this, to the present hour we both hunger and thirst, and we are poorly clothed and beaten and homeless. He could put himself alongside those that he's talking about here in verse 37. He knew what they were going through. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 10, as sorrowful yet rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing all things. There's the mentality. Having nothing, having next to nothing, being destitute, but it doesn't bother me because I have all things. Have you ever noticed that those who have more seem to think they need more? You know, they just don't have enough. And those who seem to have very little, they're satisfied with what they have. And that's the idea that Paul's talking about here in 2 Corinthians 6. Those who are destitute, it's not as though they're necessarily wanting more. They're satisfied because God is providing. And no doubt many of God's people, including the prophets of old, had the same kind of experience as the Hebrew writer here says. Well, the text goes on then in verse 38 and says this, they wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. When Jezebel massacred the prophets of God, there was a man by the name of Obadiah. Do you remember Obadiah? 1 Kings chapter 18 talks about Obadiah. He's not a prophet. He's actually the head steward in Ahab's house. And what Obadiah did, Obadiah believed in God and wanted to serve God, and he sees the king is not doing that, and of course the king's wife is not, and she's not Jewish. But what he does is then he takes 100 of the prophets of God and he hides them in caves. And then he provides for their needs. And it's never exactly clear to us from the text in 1 Kings chapter 18, where the provision is coming from, whether Ahab is providing for them without knowing, or I suspect Obadiah, through the pay that he gets from Ahab for being a steward in his house, is using his goods in order to provide for these 100 prophets. But here were some who were hidden in caves and dens of the earth, and Obadiah does that for them. In 1 Kings chapter 19, the very next chapter, remember we've got the showdown at Mount Carmel where Elijah has victory over the the prophets of Baal. It's a spiritual battle and a victory for God's people. But then in chapter 19, because Jezebel now wants to kill Elijah, he flees down to the southern part, down near Mount Horeb. And when we read the text, we find him hiding out in a cave. David, when he was on the run from King Saul, he found security in caves a lot. 1 Kings, messing up on books. 1 Samuel chapter 24 is one of those cases where we find him finding security in some of the caves. There's also some uninspired records of some of God's people who found security and safety inside of dens and caves of the earth. We mentioned last week or the week before the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And so when Judas Maccabeus is writing, he talks about Matthias and his sons, as well as Judas Maccabeus himself, and others who kept themselves alive during the time of persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes by dwelling in the wilderness and in the mountains and in caves and in dens. That was the places where they ended up dwelling. And not surprisingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in some of those caves and dens and so forth that they may have been hiding in. What we're reading about here in this latter portion of Hebrews 11, these are foreign things to us in North America. Typically in North America, our experience as God's people doesn't have this kind of harshness about it. That doesn't mean it won't ever. But it doesn't. But what we need to keep in mind is we do have some brethren in some areas of the world today who do need to meet in secret and who do need to keep themselves tucked away, as it were, whose lives are in danger simply because they're servants of God. And that's why Elijah was hiding, and that's why David was hiding, and that's why Obadiah hid the prophets of God, and that's why John Maccabeus or Judas Maccabeus and Matthias and his sons and others were hiding. They wanted to serve God faithful, and there were those who wanted to destroy them because of it. And that happens, unfortunately, in today's world as well. And if it were to happen in North America, hopefully we would still stand in faith and be willing to stand for the Lord, even if that meant going into hiding at times in order for us to be protected. So, wandered about in the sheepskins and the goatskins, wandered in the deserts, the mountains, dens and caves and so forth. And in the midst of all that, he makes this statement. He says, of whom the world was not worthy. What a powerful statement about God's people. Of whom the world was not worthy. It's a statement of value. Here's the value that God lays upon his people. The world wasn't worthy of these individuals. For many of those who have been mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, and in particular the things in the last several verses, they were outcasts of society. These are not the people that were celebrated by those that were around them. They were outcasts of society, and their value yet is beyond measure in God's perspective. Consider some examples. And some of these were outcasts to some degree, and then their value was found. But think about Joseph. Joseph was completely undervalued in his own household. His brothers hated him, sold him to be a slave, actually wanted to kill him, but ended up selling him. And then Potiphar buys him, and all he's buying is a slave. That's his perspective. This is some guy who's going to work in my household and hopefully keep things from falling apart. And what Potiphar eventually finds out, Joseph rises to the top. He's the top slave. He's still a slave in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar realizes that his household is prospering because of Joseph. And yet, let me suggest to you that he never truly understood the value of this young man who was in his house. All that Potiphar saw in this young man was, I put things in his trust and things go well for me. And it was about Potiphar and how things went for Potiphar. He didn't understand the great value that was in his house. This was a servant of God. Think about Daniel. Daniel is carted away to Babylon as a captive. And he was among those that were selected to serve in the king's court. But simply that was, he might be mopping up some floors, he might be doing some translating and menial tasks or tasks that require an education of sorts, but nothing big. And yet, as we follow Daniel, because of his faithfulness to God, he rises up and is exalted in the reigns of Nebuchadnezzar and Darius and Cyrus. And what each of them saw, they all saw something special in him, and they were influenced by him. But again, I don't know that they really grasped how important of a man he was. Not because he's Daniel, but because he's a servant of God. And each of them saw good in their kingdom because Daniel's there. But I suspect he was still undervalued compared to the value that God lays upon him. And in every age, that's the case. God's people should excel. And God's people should have great value within this world. Paul, when he's talking about you and I, this is what he says: whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men. Let me suggest to you, that's why people like Joseph excelled. And that's why people like Daniel excelled. Because whatever their circumstance was, I'm serving the Lord. I'm not just serving whoever it is, not just Potiphar and not just Nebuchadnezzar and Darius and Cyrus. I'm serving the Lord. And if we will approach things that way, if we'll live with that kind of focus, then that means that we as Christians are going to be the best workers and the best neighbors and the best citizens around. And that's not a matter of pride or self-exaltation. That's a matter of, if we do God's will, then we will be the best that we can be. And this statement would be true of you and I as well, then, that of whom the world is not worthy. Jesus, when he's talking over in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, he wants us to know where the glory goes when we live the way we ought to live. He says this: let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And that needs to be the key for us, is that glory goes to God. All right, notice verse 39 and 40. In 39 and 40 says this: all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So as we close out the chapter, the writer here now focuses on the purpose of listing all these people, this collection of faithful men and women of God, and these situations that they found themselves in. Why did he do all this? Because, we've got 40 verses almost of person, all these people. And so what was the purpose in it? He's given us example after example of people who willingly suffered affliction and did so in the pursuit of God and focused on the promise of God. That's what he focuses in on here, is the promise. But he says they did not receive the promise. Well, what promise? Back up to verse 6. In verse 6, he makes this statement. He says, but without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Now, there's a number of ways that God will reward his people, but there's one particular promise that the writer, I believe, has in mind here at the end of the book. But verse 6 says, if you want to partake of that reward, then you got to believe in God and you got to diligently seek him and serve him. So what is the reward that they did not receive, and yet he says God's going to give it to everybody all at once, to them and to us together? Throughout the text, verse 10, the patriarchs waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Verse 16, Abraham was focused on a better, that is a heavenly country. Verse 26, Moses looked to the reward. He didn't have it. He didn't get it yet. He looked to the reward. Verse 27, he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So what was it that drew their attention and caused them to serve despite all these hardships? The promise is heaven. They're all looking for heaven. One thing that all of God's people have in common is that they could see that there's something beyond this. Because if all it is this, then why would I suffer when I can go do something else? They all understood there is something beyond this, something better for us than what is in the here and now. And so they waited for heaven. They looked beyond this life to eternal life. And we and they will be made perfect together then in Christ. Again, all these having obtained a good testimony through faith did not receive the promise. God having something better for us, that they should not receive it or should not be made perfect apart from us. He's going to do it for everybody together. And so when Jesus returns, that's when they will receive the promise, and we will receive the promise, and we will be with him in eternity. John chapter 14, verse 2 and 3. I'm having trouble reading numbers out of my notes. It's not like they're small numbers. Anyhow, John 14, verse 2 and 3. Not John 4, verse 23. John 14, verse 2 and 3. Jesus says this. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. He said that to the apostles. He's gathered together with his apostles. This is on the evening when he would be betrayed and be taken into custody and beaten and eventually the next morning be put to death. But he lays out this promise to them. Again, those that were talked about in the Old Covenant, they did not receive the promise. They didn't see the realization of it yet. But they will be made perfect with us. And this is where it's going to happen. Jesus says, I'm going to go prepare a place. In my Father's house are many mansions. There's room for everybody. And I'm going to go and prepare a place. If I go and prepare a place, I will come again, he says. Listen to how the Hebrew writer draws this hall of faith to a conclusion. We might look at verse 39 and 40 as the conclusion of it. It's actually in the next chapter where he draws it to a conclusion. Here's why he's been writing these things. And so in chapter 12, look at the first two verses. Therefore, see, that's a statement of conclusion. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Where's the cloud of witnesses? Chapter 11, right? This is why he talked about all of them. He wants to urge us to be faithful, urge us to devote ourselves in service to God. Because we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Those are the kinds of things that they did. And so they laid aside things that would get in the way, and they put themselves to the task of serving God. Verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So these examples that he had just cited back in chapter 11, they are given to urge us on to faithfulness. That's the point of listing them. It's not for us to get a whole bunch of podiums to put them up on. That's not it. It's to urge us to be faithful to God. See, they were, we can be as well. And then in verse 2 of chapter 12, he now goes to the greatest example of all. And the thing is, they didn't have this example. They didn't get to watch Jesus and see what Jesus did. They didn't get to read about Jesus and find out what Jesus did. They did it before he came. But for you and I, we have this great example, this perfect example of Jesus. We actually have an advantage over those who came before Christ. Because we have God in the flesh having come and lived a life, and we have a record of it so that we know here's what God would have us do, the kind of character that he would have us have. And so we can look at this perfect example of Jesus and notice the things that the writer says. He also suffered. He talked about a lot of suffering in chapter 11. A lot of God's people of the Old Covenant suffered. He also suffered. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. He endured hostility and shame, and yet in the end, he was victorious. And so the point that the writer is making then is we can be victorious. All those of the Old Covenant, they were victorious. They haven't got the final victory yet, but they're waiting for it. And you and I, we can be victorious as well. And so we need to walk in faith, walk in an active faith. Remember at the very beginning of chapter 11, we had noted how each time he talks about faith, they did something. By faith, Noah built. By faith, Enoch was taken away. By faith, Abel gave an offering. By faith, Abraham obeyed. By faith, they always did something, right? It's an active faith. And so, in the conclusion of Hebrews 11, which is actually the first few verses of Hebrews 12, he says, let's rid our lives of sin. Let's endure hardships that come our way. Keep our eyes focused on the Savior. Trust his grace and his mercy and his patience. And in the end, eternity will be ours. That we also will sit with the Lord in his kingdom when the time is right, when he brings the faithful to be with him, when we're made perfect, as verse 40 of the previous chapter says. And so the challenge then for us is, will we walk by faith? Now, that's the whole point of Hebrews 11, walk by faith. Will we walk by faith? And we need to do so together and encourage one another and lift one another up and keep in mind victory awaits. And the great thing of all this is God's on our side. He gave this record by his Spirit so that we could read it and be encouraged. And he sent Jesus so that we could see the example and be encouraged. God's on our side, and he wants to give us victory. And so let's walk by faith. Hopefully the series has been beneficial for us and helped us to focus on faith and examples of faith, and then to walk in faith ourselves. If we can help you in any way, let us know. If we can be praying, or if we can be studying, whatever we can do to help one another to walk in faith and to achieve the victory that's in heaven by God's grace and mercy. Let us know as we stand together and sing.